Aloha and welcome. A brief message before this evening's program begins. Please enjoy the mele of West Maui through the musical albums Le Na Hono Piʻilani, Songs of West Maui, and Le Na Hono Piʻilani Na Mele Ho. The second one actually is up for Hoku, Na Hoku Hano Hano Awards this year. So congratulations to them for being finalists. Both are available digitally and everywhere. And physically at mele.com. The accompanying songbook, Le Na Hono Piʻilani, is also available from Kamehameha Publishing. All proceeds benefit Na Leo Kalele, the West Maui Kaipuni Auxiliary Program. Mahalo and enjoy the talk this evening. Aloha.
Aloha mai kako. Mahalo everyone for joining us this evening. Since 2018, Na Kaneo Maui Cultural Center has been hosting this free public HK West Maui Community Fund Kanaka Scholar Series. This series is co-sponsored by HK West Maui Community Fund, the University of Hawaii, Maui College, Hawaiian Studies Department, the Kuei Petition Hui. The lectures are monthly, occur monthly. The series features a host of new established scholars, also innovators in their research and work on Hawaii and Hawaiian communities. We proudly present this to you via Zoom and live through HK West Maui's Facebook page. Tonight's presentation, Shaping Oceania Islander Connections Past, Present, and Future. Dr. Kealani Cook is an assistant professor of history at the UH West Maui, Oʻahu, originally from Waimea, Hawaii Island. Dr. Cook is also a historian who began working at UH West Oʻahu in fall of 2015. His published work focuses on ties between Hawaii and the Pacific. Give a virtual round of applause for tonight's speaker. Aloha and Dr. Kealani Cook. Aloha.
Mahalo. Aloha kako. I should add, I actually started off at UH Maui College from 2011 to 2014 before moving to West Oʻahu. So as much as I would have liked to go back to Maui for this, I'm looking at the numbers, I'm glad we're doing this virtually. So let me share my screen real quick. Oh, that's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Sorry, is it sharing on your side?
Yes, we can see it, but you might want to switch to slideshow view.
Okay.
It's right by the Zoom slider. If you click the one right to the left of that.
Show.
Or the presenter view button.
Presenter view. Okay. What? Oh my God. So out of it. Okay.
Looks good.
Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, this is something I've been thinking about for, well, since grad school, and probably the worst place to start off any talk is this is something from grad school that I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's not really history as much as historiography, which is the study of history. And there's very few people who find historiography interesting, and they're all historians. So hopefully there's a bunch of historians out there. One of the things I want to kind of take a look at is in the last, let's see, what is it? 2020. The last 60 years of Pacific history, one of the things that has changed the most has been essentially the inclusion of islanders as active agents in history. So island peoples, Hawaiians, Tongans, Chamorro, etc., as actual active participants in the history. And then when you look at maybe the last 30 to 40 years, more and more active Pacific Islanders as active writers and creators of history, and using more and more Pacific Island sources, etc. Now, one of the things that has not really changed that much is that when people talk about the Pacific as a whole, or Pacific Islands as a whole, or Oceania, there is a tendency to essentially talk about islanders in island groups, right? Talk about Hawaiians in Hawaii, talk about Tongans in Tonga, talk about Chamorro in Guam, in the Northern Marianas, or sometimes both. But not really to talk about how islanders have essentially shaped and used a broader Oceania. When most books talk about the Pacific, anything beyond the island or island group level is almost always dictated by what the empires are doing, what the empires are, often imperial imaginations, they'll admit that the empires are imagining the Pacific to be a certain way to justify things that they're doing. But there isn't much examination of how Pacific Islanders are doing that at the same time. And Epeli Hau'ofa, I'm not sure how many people, I mean, I'm imagining a lot of people would be kind of familiar with Epeli Hau'ofa's work. But one of the things he talks about is rethinking this for the future, to imagine, well, to stop imagining the empires or the former empires that ruled over the Pacific in much of the 20th century as our only networks, our only relations, and to increasingly look to other parts of the Pacific for shaping a future. And in other parts of, Pacific studies, we're seeing this more and more. One of the places that is lagging behind, which we tend to do, is history. So this is essentially an attempt to try to ask the question, how did islanders shape Oceania as a region beyond just the island or island group level? And God, this is one of the, I wish I could see faces so I could tell whether or not this was making sense. But essentially, we know Hawaiian shaped Hawaiian history. And we know, going back to these same examples, Tongans shaped Tongan history and Chamorro shaped Chamorro history. But how did they, in their own ways and together, shape Oceania as a region? And this is essentially an attempt to look at one way of understanding a longer history of oceanic connections and ties between different island groups, and to try and look at how that shaped a modern, brought us to where we are for Pacific Islanders, increasingly imagining Oceania the way that Epeli Hau'ofa was talking about, as one thing, as a connected sea of islands rather than a set of places sprinkled across an ocean and gobbled up by empires. So I'm also going to do the one thing that I tell all my students not to do in a talk or in a short paper, which is I'm going to go really shallow and broad rather than in depth and narrow. So yeah, hopefully somebody's still awake at the end of this thing. All right, so the easy one is going to be settlement. When we look at the Pacific, I'm going to try and take this sort of long view and look at all these different ways that islanders were connected to each other, tied to each other beyond the island and island group level. And the initial one is settlement. Yeah, I'm not sure how much to go into this because it's kind of Pacific Studies, Hawaiian Studies 101 or 107. And we're tied to other parts of Oceania, tied to other parts of the Pacific, because a lot of the settlement ties us together hundreds, thousands of generations beyond, well, not thousands, but hundreds of generations back. So, okay, there's always going to be some debate within this sort of anthropological community about how the settlement worked, where exactly the specific lines of that people go directly from the Philippines into Micronesia. Terangi Hiro was like they went into Micronesia and then down into Polynesia, and Melanesia got skipped completely, or was it two routes, one in the north, one in the south into Micronesia, and then a second group going up from Melanesia? Essentially, none of that matters for the purposes of this lecture or this talk, because when it comes down to it, one of the ways that the islands and all the island groups in the Pacific are related is that if you go back far enough, there's got to be some movement through there that connects it to everybody else. And even though there's two main migrations, there's a Papuan migration that goes into Melanesia, and then, well, near Melanesia, here, near Oceania, and the Austronesian migration that goes further out into Polynesia, Micronesia, far this part of Melanesia as well. Once they start doing the DNA analysis, etc., even those two separate migrations, over time, there's considerable movement of people, and it can be traced in our DNA. So this is the one part I didn't really put that much thought into it, because it was just like, it's the settlement part. That's where we came from. So that's just kind of jumping through. Okay, next up, we do have a number of different indications in oral histories. In Hawaii, it's mo'olelo. In other places, it's going to be, similar oral history patterns. And what we can see from this is a long, kind of this long practice of telling history, of historiography, that looks to other islands as places of importance, that looks to other islands as places of cultural importance, historical importance, etc. And even in cases where it doesn't, like, perhaps it's not an exact, history as in the Western perception of like, this is an exact recounting of fact. What these mo'olelo tell us is that there is a lot of importance placed in understanding Pacific Island histories as connected to other islands and other island groups. So a couple of examples here. I'm going to start with some Hawaii ones. The whole Pili and Pa'ao story, the mo'olelo around there, where Pa'ao comes in from somewhere in Kahiki, and we're not sure. Kahiki can be Tahiti, but Kahiki can also be just somewhere else. It becomes the catch-all term for other places. People have traced it, have argued that Kahiki in this particular case, Pa'ao comes from Samoa, or he may have come from Tahiti. Regardless, the story is repeated back down through generations that Pa'ao was a navigator and a kahuna, and a very sort of prominent person somewhere in Kahiki. He leaves because he gets in a fight with his brother, and comes to Hawaii and brings with him a bunch of other sort of skilled people, people of mana and people of knowledge and intelligence. And they come to Hawaii and bring in, like, Pa'ao is remembered as bringing in things. And these become really important religious and cultural things. Like some have credited him with the idea of the Luakini Heao. That's credited sometimes to Pa'ao. At a certain point, Pa'ao is looking around. He stays on the Big Island. He looks around the Big Island. He sees that the Big Island chiefs have married too much into the Maka'ainana. Their bloodlines are too low, and he can't really compete with the Kauai and the Oʻahu chiefs. So he goes back to Kahiki and brings back Pili, who's supposed to have a high genealogy. And until the 19th century, all of the mo'i will trace their lineages back to Pili. And Heva, who's the kahuna under Ka'ahumanu, who sort of helped overthrow the Kapu system, he's going to trace his genealogy back to Pa'ao. So we see in these mo'olelo, or in this particular mo'olelo, that for Big Island chiefly lines, which will eventually become the kingdom's chiefly lines, they will trace that genealogy back to Pili, and that connection to Kahiki is going to be important. It is going to be important that, like in Hawaiian history, that Hawaii is connected to these other places, that it is not an isolated place. But we see a similar thing with the story of La'amai Kahiki, and this is connected into the Olopana and the Moikeha stories. And if you don't know these stories, then Google them, because I'm going to have to run fast through this. But either Olopana and Moikeha, in some versions, they're already in Kahiki and they come to Hawaii. In other versions, they're in Hawaii and then they go to Kahiki, and then Moikeha comes back. But La'amai Kahiki is the adopted son of Moikeha, and Moikeha is ruling on Kauai and wants to see La'amai Kahiki, but La'a is still in Kahiki because, Moikeha and Olopana got into a fight. Moikeha comes back, Olopana stays back. Angry brothers split. One stays in Kahiki, one goes to Hawaii, kind of repeating that story over again. And La'a comes, and he's remembered for chiefly lines that trace back to La'a. La'a brings the pahu, the drum, he's credited for being the one who introduces the pahu to Hawaii. And again, it's the key part is that in these stories, important things are connected with Kahiki. Important things are connected with other island groups, with these other island peoples, that Hawaiian mo'olelo do not remember Hawaiian history as isolated and one place. It's always connected back. And it's kind of funny, in some of these versions, La'a is actually born on Oʻahu. He's like, but no one ever remembers him as La'amai Wailua. Like, he's La'amai Kahiki. And why? It's because that connection to Kahiki is important. Those connections to other islands help to put Hawaiian history, to put mo'olelo into a broader framework that connects to other parts of the Pacific. So even in the mo'olelo, Hawaii is never isolated and by itself. It is connected to these other places. And same thing will go to other stories. Non-modal, I can't remember the dude's name. The guy who defeats the Saudalar dynasty that created non-modal on Pohnpei, he flees to another island, and it's his family from another island that takes care of him and allows him to come back and conquer the Saudelars. Like, island histories in the mo'olelo and similar forms throughout the Pacific are not told just of one place. They are told of that place in connection to the rest of Kahiki. And this is one of my favorite ones. And this image here, it's the images connected to the story of Taima and Tilafainga, who are twin goddess sisters. They're conjoined twins sometimes, but they're goddesses, so they can split sometimes. And in Samoa, they're credited with bringing tattooing to Samoa. And so at that point it's not a mo'olelo, but I'll call it a mo'olelo. There's no tattooing in Samoa, but there's tattooing in Fiji. And they know about the tattooing in Fiji, and they want that, because let's face it, like, tattoos are like, they're freaking awesome. I want that too. Let's go to Fiji. Let's go get the tattooing. So they go to Fiji and they learn all about tattooing, and they learn this long, song that has all the knowledge sort of wrapped up into it. And they learn all this stuff. And in Fiji, tattooing was primarily female, and women did the tattooing, and women also were mostly the people who got tattooed. And so the last line of the song is, tattoo the women, do not tattoo the men. And then they're swimming from Fiji back over to Samoa. And when they're off the coast of Hawaii, they're hungry because they swam from Fiji, and they're singing the song, and they're just about to sing the line about tattoo the women, do not tattoo the men. And they see a giant clam on the bottom, and they're like, you know what, let's go catch that clam and eat it. So they go down and they battle with the giant clam, and they bring it up, and the song changes to tattoo the men, do not tattoo the women. And I like this story for a couple of reasons. One, it involves like twin conjoined goddesses battling a giant clam, and that's freaking cool. But also it tells us that even this incredibly important part of Samoan culture is going to be tied to another place and another thing. That an important part of that thing is that it's like, yeah, it's not just a Samoan thing. It is very much a Samoan thing, but it's a Samoan thing that ties them to Fiji. It ties them to other parts of Kahiki. And the other part I really like about this story is, in order for this to make sense and to be meaningful, people in Samoa have to know that they have to understand the context. They have to understand the context of, we have very similar like waist-oriented tattooing, except ours is male and theirs is female. How do we make sense of this? And one of the ways that they make sense of this is like, well, this mo'olelo will tell us why this is so. And that only matters if they have enough contact with Fiji, which they do have a lot of contact with Fiji, that they have enough contact with Fiji that they need to explain this thing, why it's different, even though it is connected, why it's different. So I don't know. I really like that story. It has a giant clam battle. Okay. Other things we also see in a lot of oral histories, and in this is something like the Anthro people are super into, but we see this in a lot of oral histories as well, oral histories and into contemporary periods, as networks. Certain networks that you will always see movement and contact back and forth between. So let's see. Okay, Yap. So one of the things that, if you Google Yapese Empire, sometimes stuff will come up, and most of it is questioning whether or not the idea of a Yapese Empire makes sense. It's some Anthro was in Yap and was talking to the people of Yap and came up with this idea of a Yapese Empire. And basically, people from one part of Yap were like, yeah, we control kind of everything all the way down to Sadawal. And then when you go and more people went and asked more questions, and what it came down to is there's this long-standing, and we're talking about, what is it, like 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000 kilometers of persistent trade, generation after generation after generation after generation. And the people on the low-lying atolls, they will start all the way at the far end and go through on this sort of voyage and collect things from all these different parts of the Carolines and get to Yap and present them to, and it's presented as a gift. It's not an exchange. It's very clear. They're all like, it's not an exchange, it's a gift. We give this gift to the people of this one part of Yap, and then they give us things back. And the people of the islands, of the low-lying atolls, they will get things that they can't really grow. Like, look, you can make decent canoes, plank built out of breadfruit, but you can get bigger trees on Yap, and it makes a lot more sense to get your canoes from Yap. There's certain things that you can get on the islands that are going to be hard to get on Yap, certain types of shells, etc. And essentially, this whole system, it's a way of constantly exchanging things that perhaps they could get away with not having, but in exchanging, they're keeping a relationship between all of these atolls and Yap. And one of the reasons it's really important to keep those relationships going for the people on those atolls, like this exchange is partly about getting some stuff, and we're trading or exchanging stuff kind of through gifts. But a big part of it is you want to maintain those relationships, because the relationship to Yap is the thing that's going to allow you to survive when your island gets hit by a hurricane. Your island gets hit by a hurricane or a tidal wave, and your whole island is 15 or less feet above sea level. You're wiped for a couple of years. And Yap was the place that's a high island. You can go to Yap and you can thrive and you can survive there. Not thrive, but you can survive there because you have these connections to Yap. And that's one of the things that we start to see a lot, is that there is a clear effort throughout this history of creating and maintaining relationships between island groups and between islands, and that the maintenance of those relationships is often essential for later on being able to get resources from one another. And the resources may seem relatively minor. There's the Kula ring. There's, I don't know, the anthro people, again, really into talking about the Kula ring. But basically, they're exchanging ceremonial goods that don't seem to have much actual practical value. But the important things, like, and a lot of effort it goes into exchanging these goods back and forth along these two rings, one going this way and one going this way. But what it comes down to is all that effort that goes into exchanging the goods isn't about exchanging the goods. It's about maintaining those relationships. And those relationships are the things that allow them to depend on each other when they need resources, when they need or just prefer to have some movement or some travel of people, etc. Those rings are the thing that allow them to do that. And we see over and over again these historical networks that are kept and developed and built and maintained in order to always have resources. Not resources in terms of things, but resources in terms of people, relationships. I mean, these relationships are resources in Pacific history. And we see over and over again, maintain your networks, you maintain those relationships. And those are some of the most important resources that you can have in the Pacific, because we're in kind of a weird spot in Hawaii, because the islands are big enough that essentially Hawaii can be by itself. But in most places you can't. There's just, you're too close to other people, and the islands just aren't big enough to pull that off. And even in the case of Hawaii, until the population got large enough, Hawaii couldn't be alone. We relied on being able to connect with other people and maintain those relationships, and arguably are doing so again. Oh, this one too. If you, sorry, I need to have another map up there, and I forgot to put it on. In Raiatea, at Taputapu Atea Marae, there is a long history of this thing called a long sort of memory of this thing called the Fa'atawaroha, or some variety of that. So like the alliance of friendship, the alliance of kinship. And it's based on a woman from Rotuma, which is off by Fiji, and a man from Bora Bora, which is right close to Raiatea, marrying, and then their son helping to create this large alliance. And it's not everybody in between, but it definitely seems to be a lot of the people linguistically who are very similar to Hawaiians, people from the sort of, I guess, the late migration. And it was split in half. There was Te Ao Uri and Te Ao Tea. So Te Ao Uri would be everybody from basically Raiatea, Tahiti on that side, and then Te Ao Tea, which would be they split Raiatea in half, and then the eastern half of Raiatea, western half of Raiatea, all the way to Rotuma, and including Aotearoa. And there's this yearly, or maybe not yearly, definitely actually, I don't know if I've ever read how often, but it was a regular sort of scheduled meeting at this place certain times a year when it's easiest to travel there from far away. And they would meet at Taputapu Atea Marae. Everyone would come in with sacrifices and with ceremonial drums. There would be a large ceremony on the marae. And then after the ceremony, there would be this sort of, general exchange of everything, of people or marriages, etc. But it'd be this moment when this huge stretch of water, all these islands and this huge stretch of water would come together, and they would just essentially maintain and renew relationships, renew these relationships that were the most important resource. I mean, of course, after water, etc. But at a certain point, one of the chiefs from a chief from Raiatea kills Pa'awatea, who is a Rarotongan priest. And so he's part of Te Aotea. So basically a chief from Te Aouri kills a priest from Te Aotea, and everyone from Te Aotea is like, oh, we got to go. So apparently first they got that chief back, and then they split and they left all their stuff, and they took their canoes and went and just gone. And the Fa'atawaroha was dead. And this story, there's in some of the Maori songs, there's elements of it. They left through the pass at Avarua, and there's a thing called the Sin at Avarua in a Maori legend about the Aotea canoe that came and founded a bunch of the iwi in Aotearoa. And there's also some validation of this story from Rarotonga, which I'll get to in about 2 slides. So just keep this in mind, that this was another network, this the Fa'atawaroha network of late Polynesian migration, Let's see. Oh, crap. And then this one. So this gets its own slide. And honestly, this is its own damn book. I was supposed to say this at the beginning. A lot of this is not based on my own primary research, because it's a survey, it's looking at a lot of things. So it's using a lot of other people's research and then trying to pull them together to get a broader view of the Pacific as a whole. But there is a ton written about just this thing, the political connection between Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa. And it has been argued, and it's a very easy argument to make, that even though you can tell the histories of Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa by themselves, you cannot tell them properly without telling the history of the connections between them, because they're so closely intertwined through politics and culture, etc. So let's see, I'm just going to run through some of this. There's a bunch of connections between Samoa and Tonga in terms of politics, especially chiefly level marriages. So let's see. The Tui Manua and Tui Tonga are often allied, and there's a lot of accounts of marriages back and forth. Some of the Tui Tongas supposedly were also Tui Manua. So Tui Manua would be from what's now Eastern Samoa, American Samoa, but from there ruling, or not ruling, but having huge influence over all of Samoa and further out towards the west, towards even to Tonga. The Tui Tonga historically was the ruler of all of Tonga, and then later on becomes a sort of a not a figurehead, but a spiritual ruler of Tonga, where other Tuis are controlling the actual politics of Tonga. But there's these close alliances between the Tui Manua and the Tui Tonga dynasties for much of their history, marriages back and forth, and in some accounts, even possibly people having both titles at once. There are many of the Tui Tonga and the Tui Ha'atakalawa. The Tui Ha'atakalawa are that's the Tui, the king, the high chief, paramount chief that becomes the political leader once the Tui Tonga becomes just a spiritual leader. But many of the Tui Tonga and the Tui Ha'atakalawa will have Samoan spouses and Samoan mothers. And in many ways, those titles have a lot of the way the system is set up does seem to connect well into Samoan politics as well into Tongan politics. The first Tui Kanokopolu, so Tui Kanokopolu eventually pushes out the Tui Ha'atakalawa, and these families are all, one group, and they're kind of, anyway, these titles are handed down in these same families, but eventually the Tui Kanokopolu will sort of displace the other two as the political and military leader of Tonga. And the first Tui Kanaka Polu's mother will also be Samoan. In addition, while all this is going on, there is a brief period where Tonga will, in some accounts, rule over Samoa, and other accounts have considerable control over Samoa, which would be two very different things. Either way, it's remembered in Samoa as a period of basically like the Tongans being oppressive, Tongan leaders being oppressive in Samoa. And at a certain point, these three brothers, whose names I have forgotten because I'm not a very good historian. It was Tuna, Fata, and the other one. But anyway, they lead a rebellion and they push out the Tongan chief who's ruling over Samoa. And as he's fleeing, he says, well fought, brave warrior, so Malia Toa, and kind of promises that he will not come back again to attack Samoa. If he comes back again, it will be as a friend. And that deal seems to be specifically with that those families, not with all of Samoa, because the Tongans will come back and Samoans will go to Tonga. There will be a lot of infighting or fighting back and forth because the places are very close together. But that phrase, Malia Toa, becomes a title, and these two brothers fight over it. And while they're fighting, the other brother comes in and basically says, like, breaks up the fight. And they're like, no, you know what? You should be the Malia Toa. So that is still one of the most important, like one of the four most important titles in Samoa is Malia Toa. And that title, just like the Tongan titles are very strongly connected to Samoa, this, one of the most important Samoan titles, is strongly connected to this history of Tonga being in Samoa as well. You really, like, literally just cannot tell the histories of politics of what we would call Ali'i Nui, but these paramount Ali'i, these ruling chiefs. Actually, they're not really ruling chiefs, but these high chiefly titles, without telling the story of the connections between these places. And similarly, the story of Fiji and Tonga. So once you get to, let's see, when most of the heavy interaction between Tonga and Samoa seems to sort of ease, one of the things that's happening is the Tongan chiefs are getting more and more interested in Fiji. And so you start seeing a lot more connections back and forth to Fiji at a certain point in Tongan history. And you'll see, for instance, the Tui Tonga Fifine. So the Tui Tonga's, it's the highest ranking woman in Tonga, who's usually a sister of the Tui Tonga, will be given this title, and she'll be one of the most sacred people in Tonga. But she has to have a Fijian husband. Her husband has to come from Fiji, because that way she won't become a potential source of power for a Tongan chief that marries her. So her husband has to come from Fiji, and it will actually create a whole chunk of the sort of Tongan courts, the Tongan ruling courts, which will be the House of Fiji, the sort of Fijian connected parts of the Tongan royal families. All of this will continue into the 19th century. We will see, for instance, George Tupou, who's going to become the chief that conquers all of Tonga, unifies Tonga, essentially Tonga's version of Kamehameha, except he lives a lot longer. So he lives all the way until 1899, 1901. Historians are supposed to be good at dates and names, and I'm not really good with either. But George Tupou one of his first wives is going to be a Samoan woman, and that's going to be a really important marriage in terms of setting him up for alliances and power early on in his career. Once he's unifying all of Tonga, other Tongan chiefs are kind of pushed out if they want to have any sort of chance at political power. And one of them, a younger nephew of his, Ma'afu, will go to Fiji and now actually Ma'afu will be ruling over a huge chunk of Fiji through most of the middle part of the 19th century. Arguably, at certain points, he is the most powerful chief in Fiji, and he is a Tongan chief. And so there's this constant movement back and forth, these connections, these ties politically. And for a Samoan chief, having those Tongan ties may be really important in creating alliances in Samoa during warfare. And the same thing for the Tongan chiefs, having those connections to Fiji and Samoa will be really important for them, because you can use those connections to get resources. You can use those connections to get often warriors. You can use those connections to get an escape route if you lose and you need to flee. So it's really important to have all of these connections and ties. And those will be maintained all the way up until the present, even though, nobody's invading each other anymore. So that's a good thing. Then really quickly, the contact period, contact with the Hawaii. The one person I really want to talk about is Tupaia. And I'm not going to spend too much time on him because he does get talked up a lot. But this is a drawing by Tupaia, who was a Raiatean navigator that was living in Tahiti and becomes part of Cook's crew in Cook's first voyage. Tupaia is a navigator. The Raiateans are particularly good navigators. That's part of the reason, like, it seems to be connected into that Tapu Tapu Atea Marae, which is in Raiatea. They're also missionaries from Tapu Tapu Atea Marae, and they're the Oro, which is the son of Kanaloa in Tahiti. They're doing a lot of missionary voyaging and like revival work, this Aʻiʻoi society. So the Raiateans are traveling a lot for all these different reasons. But he's a well-regarded navigator in Raiatea and Tahiti, but politically things are getting a little hot for him. So he jumps aboard the ship with Cook and he convinces Banks, who's one of the fancy scientist noble types that's aboard the ship, to convince Cook to take him along. And Tupaia on that first voyage is going to essentially end up first he takes them to all the islands that he's just been to, and he's like, yeah, we'll just go like 3 days out this way and then we turn left and we're there. I've been there, they know me, it's good. And then he takes them to a bunch of places he's never been, but his father or grandfather further back had been and had taught him how to get to. And he ends up drawing a chart, and it took a long time for people to kind of unpack the chart, but essentially he drew a chart that could get you roughly, you got to have a little look, but it could get you to Oʻahu and it could get you to Aotearoa. So he's basically showing them how to get to all these places based on where he's been and the basic where his father's been, where his grandfather's been, and all the knowledge that's been passed down to him. And it's not just that he's taking them to these places, but he's acting as a cultural broker. So some places he's stopping and is like, I know these guys, they're my friends. Cook, meet the people of this island, they're my friends. He's brokering cultural contact for a lot of these people. He is essentially the one that's helping them understand what the hell is going on with this big boat coming in with all these people, like tiny people wearing lots of clothes. Who are they? And he will kind of explain it. He will often, according to Banks and Cook's stuff, he will often swing it in a certain way so that it's like, well, this is my boat and these are my white people that I brought. This is my boat. I'm Tupaia, and like in Aotearoa, it's remembered as Tupaia's boat. But he's kind of guiding a lot of the stuff to prevent a lot of the sort of violent reactions that we see in a lot of first contact, the stuff that happens when the first white people get to Tahiti and they start killing people. The kind of thing that happens, actually, it still happens when Cook and Tupaia get to Aotearoa, but he seems to try and work some of that out. And then again in Hawaii, when Cook lands on Kauai first, like one of the first things that happens is one of the Hawaiians gets shot on Kauai. So Tupaia is definitely negotiating these things. He's trying to control them for his own purposes, but also he's acting as the filter through which a lot of the first contact happens. He also takes up watercolor painting. So he's the Pacific's first watercolor painter. And this is him drawing a Maori dude trading a lobster for a piece of kapa. One of the things the Maori were most into, like all the European stuff, they're like, oh, that stuff is cool. Like, we like all these things, but they're like, where did you guys get all this kapa? Because you can't grow Valke very well in Aotearoa because it's too cold. So they only had like little pieces of kapa and they valued it highly. But they're like, cook them are coming in from like Tahiti and they have like these huge chunks of kapa. So this picture is actually a haole guy trading a piece of kapa for it wasn't a lobster, it's like a crayfish or something. And then Tupaya sitting there painting it. So even in these contact moments where it's supposed to be about like, you know, it's always written up as the big moment of European contact. Even there, it's this islander who's directing a lot of it, who's not controlling it, but definitely he's the filter through which everyone is understanding what's going on. Anyway, I like it, partly because I like this picture of someone trading kapa for a crayfish. Moving on to the 19th century, we see a lot of the same stuff happening throughout the 19th century. This is where, like, a lot of what we've talked about before, it's easy for the historiography to kind of pick up these things happening before, and the anthropologists, etc., because it happened before the white people showed up. Once the white people show up, the tendency in historiography has been to essentially see the white people as the only ones who are moving between islands, and everyone else is just, they're just natives stuck on their little islands. They're here, 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 and here. And we're the only thing that's, you know, creating any contact between them. We're the only thing that's making connections. But what we see in the 19th century is actually there is a lot of effort either maintaining those old relationships or creating new relationships between Pacific Islanders, often incorporating the new technology that's coming in, the new shipping, etc., but at the same time seeking to maintain or recreate or sort of reimagine a lot of the relationships that had existed before. So let's see, the Tongans under Ma'afu, not a particularly peaceful relationship, but what Ma'afu is able to do is building off of there's an existing movement back and forth of young Tongans, especially going to Fiji to essentially act as mercenaries in order to get canoes, because Tonga is a much smaller island. Fiji has much larger trees, much harder woods. You can get better canoes in Fiji than you can in Tonga. So they go to the Lau Islands in Fiji and act as essentially as mercenaries in order in exchange for canoes. And then Ma'afu, when he shows up, one of the reasons he actually goes is George Tupou seems to suggest that he go and do something about these guys, because these guys are getting rowdy. And often when they're coming back to Fiji, they're a disturbance. So, or some coming back from Fiji, not to Fiji, coming back to Tonga from Fiji, they're creating a disturbance because they've been basically raiding for 2 or 3 years. So Ma'afu goes and he brings all the Tongans in Fiji under his control, and he's building off of those old relationships. He's like, a lot of his power there is still his alliance with different Fijian chiefs, but he's sort of rethinking this for this new period, because this new period is, okay, I can't go back to Tonga because George Tupou, my uncle, controls everything. I have to create something new, and that new thing is going to be essentially a Lao kingdom, a Tongan-led Lao kingdom in Fiji. Lao being the islands in Tonga that are in Fiji that he's on. Rethinking the old networks, rethinking these old relationships, and creating something new. Let's see, who else does this? Oh, Lorenz Gonchor has written a book about the Hawaiian Kingdom and how other Pacific chiefs and kings use the Hawaiian Kingdom as a model for trying to get a government that will be recognized by the Europeans, and George Tupou's first major constitution will actually be modeled off of the Hawaiian Constitution of 1864. Others will try and, in Samoa, Mauli Atoa will try and use, Mauli Atoa Laupepa will try and use that 1864 constitution, change it a little in order to create something based on the Hawaiian Constitution. And the other thing that happens is, well, one of the other things that happens is Kalakaua in 1880. So in 1880, Kalakaua has a couple of political steps back in Hawaii, and does the sort of classic thing where if things aren't going well domestically, do a big foreign trip. He goes worldwide. He does a circumnavigation of the world. And Tiffany Ng, if you want to read more about that, read Tiffany Ng's book. It's got a bunch of great stuff on there. But while he's in Japan, he meets with the emperor and he lays it down like, listen, we are some of the last independent places in the world, and neither of us right now are under threat of being invaded by the Europeans or by the Americans, but it's only a matter of time. So we should probably do something, and it's going to be much easier for us to avoid being colonized together than it will separately. And Matsuhito, the emperor, agrees, and they kind of lay out this idea where, okay, Matsuhito will try and unify a bunch of the Asian countries, and Kalakaua will try and do that in the Pacific, and they'll create an alliance. And then Matsuhito later on is like, you know what, I'm going to back out of this because actually I'm a lot closer to just creating my own empire at this point. And if I start something right now, we might get the Americans breathing down our necks. Rather, we will go and just invade China in 10, 15 years. Kalakaua comes back to the Pacific and keeps thinking about this plan. And in 1884, when the European powers go through Africa, well, not go through Africa, they sit around a map of Africa in Berlin and draw lines on it and split it up between the different powers. Kalakaua knows that the Pacific is next. So he, first he sends out a diplomatic protest saying like, you know, please don't come to the Pacific and do that crap that you just did in Africa. But he knows that they're coming. So in 1887, December 1886, he sends an embassy to Samoa with John E. Bush and Henry Poor to meet with Mauli Atoa Laupepa. Not sure if the cursor is showing up, but Poor is this guy on the far right. The next one is John E. Bush, and the next one in is Mauli Atoa Laupepa. So Mauli Atoa Laupepa has been trying to unify Samoa, and essentially the embassy goes down and signs a deal with him. Within a month, they've signed a new deal with him, creating a confederacy between Hawaii and Samoa. And then the next step was supposed to be to go to Tonga and sign up the Tongans. One of the problems is that Mauli Atoa Laupepa doesn't actually have control of all of Samoa, so they have to spend more time down there trying to get everybody in agreement in Samoa, including Mauli Atoa's main opponent, Tupua Tamasese. They're on the verge of getting all those things signed, but this is 1887 and the bayonet coup occurs in Hawaii and the entire mission is withdrawn. So it's an attempt to create a new network. It is an attempt to create a formal political alliance that will allow them to try and avoid empire, try and avoid getting sucked up into empire the way at that point Kalakaua can see we are in danger of being within the next 20 or 30 years, or sooner. Another major one in the 19th century, Islander missionaries. When we talk about the story of Christianization of the Pacific, it's often imagined as what we see to the left, which is like, this is pulled from a missionary magazine, so obviously they're going to play it up, but it's these godlike European missionaries sitting in the middle and then like the natives laying their idols before them. And this was sort of like, this is how Rarotonga was Christianized. And that's kind of the story that's later on told by the English missionaries. But what's not told is as often is the story of Papeiha, who was actually a Raiatan when the Tahitians and when Pomare II converts to Christianity after about 15 or 20 years of the Christians kind of badgering him. He converts to Christianity and then he conquers all of Tahiti. All the chiefs that are connected to him in other islands like Raiatea, etc., they convert. And so you end up with a bunch of Raiatans converting and then becoming missionaries. And they had already been good missionaries for Oro before. And a bunch of the Raiatans become missionaries for Christianity. And this dude, Papeiha, is actually like him and one other Raiatan are dropped off on this island of Aitutaki. And within 2 years, the Europeans come back and they're like, I don't know, maybe he's still alive. He's converted the entire island, and they're sending like goods back and forth to Raiatea, including all of their old gods. They burned a bunch of them, and they saved a couple of them to send to Raiatea to show that they are now Christians. And so the Europeans, I think it's Williams, picks up Papeiha, and they go to Rarotonga, and they're looking for Rarotonga. They miss it like 3 or 4 times, but there's a couple of Rarotongans that they picked up on Aitutaki who had been shipwrecked there, and they find Rarotonga, they land. The other Rarotongans that have been on Aitutaki are like, oh yeah, these guys have come to talk to you about Jesus. And they start conversing back and forth. And this is where the Fa'atawaroha thing comes back in. The Rarotongans are like, so where are you from exactly? And Papeiha is like, Raiatea. And they're like, Raiatea? Where the hell is our drum? And why did you kill our priest? So we're talking about generations later, there's verification from Raiatea of the Fa'atawaroha thing, and that they're still kind of, or from Rarotonga of the Fa'atawaroha thing, and they're still kind of pissed about it. But the Europeans once again ditch Papeiha and one other Raiatan on the island, and within 2 years, the entire island is Christian. And this happens over and over and over again. The most prolific missionaries in the Pacific were not white people. The most prolific missionaries in the Pacific were islanders. And it's because they're able to use those connections, the cultural connections, historical connections, etc., to create essentially they create a Tahitian Raiatan Christianity, and that's what spreads throughout a lot of the region, the Cook Islands, etc., and including in Hawaii. The American missionaries weren't having that much success in Hawaii until 2 Tahitians show up. Tahitians, they're recorded as Tahitians, but one could suspect that they're Raiatans, Auna and Taua, and they immediately, like that night, are brought into Kahumanu and Keopuolani's courts. They tell them about what's happening in Tahiti, and that is the moment where Kahumanu and Keopuolani really start moving towards Christianity. And eventually, let's see, Hawaiians will become missionaries. They'll go to the Marquesas and different, the Carolines, not the Carolines, Marshalls, Kiribati. You have in Samoa, there's 2 churches in Samoa. There was the Lotu Tahiti, which is the LMS, because Tahitian missionaries, Tahiti, the Tahitian missionaries came in, and that's the Lotu Tahiti. And there's the Lotu Tonga, which is the Methodist church, the Wesleyan or Methodist churches. And that's because those missionaries that came in are Tongan. And George Tupou will continue he eventually becomes a church leader in Tonga and then creates his own Church of Tonga, the Christian Church of Tonga. And he will have a huge role in keeping that flow of Tongan missionaries into Samoa as well. So throughout the 19th century, in all these different ways, we continue to see islanders shaping the history of Oceania. They're shaping other islands. They're shaping how Pacific history is happening, not just in their own island groups, but in all of the Pacific as well. Sorry, there's a little chat. Oh, crap. I'm running out of time. Okay, really quick. Academics and intellectuals. We see a bunch of academics and intellectuals that will continue to shape this, and they'll becoming more and more and more explicit, not just about individual connections, like we're connected to that place, we're connected to that place, but thinking about a broader and broader set of connections that would sort of be what we might think of, as Polynesia or Oceania. John Tamatoa Baker, who's on the left, model for the Kamehameha statue. He's going to go through, he's Hawaiian and Tahitian and Haole, and he'll go through the Pacific in 1907, right back to Kealoha Aina, and be constantly talking about all the different ways that we're connected to all these different places, and really putting forward for a Hawaiian audience how important it is to maintain and remember that we are part of Oceania, not just newly, this newly connected part of the United States, that we're still part of Oceania. And Te Rangi Hiroa, who there's a bunch of stuff in the Te Rangi Hiroa stuff, or when you're reading through his things, that are like, he's doing anthro from the early 20th century. So there's a lot of head measuring and that kind of crap. But he's also doing a lot of this forming of ideas about what Oceania is, and how you cannot understand what it is to be Maori unless you start to understand what it is to be Pacific. And that the same is true for all these other parts of the Pacific. Cultural revival, the Mao story. Everyone knows that we got navigation back from Mao. And that's not the only case. There's Mao bringing navigation back to Hawaii, and then Nainoa them taking it to every place else that had sort of lost it, often in the areas with similar linguistic trends to Hawaii. Let's see, there's Andre Perez them and the Hui Kalai Aina that they're doing, but they have their master, one of their master carvers is Sam Ka'ai that's teaching them how to carve ki'i, and the other one is Lionel Grant, who's this like amazing Maori master carver. Keone Nunez, learning how to do Hawaiian tattooing, traditional Hawaiian tattooing, in large part by learning Samoan tattooing, and then having sort of recreating Hawaiian tattooing from there. There is a clear trend throughout the last 30, 40 years, 40 years, definitely in Hawaii, but in other places as well, of using the connections and ties, sometimes, creating new connections and ties to other parts of Oceania, like using those connections in cultural revival, using those connections to renew parts of the culture, and in some cases develop something completely new. What Nainoa Thompson them are teaching is not strictly ancient Hawaiian navigation. What they're teaching is modern Hawaiian navigation, as based on the stuff that they are able to find from Hawaiian navigation, based on Mao's teaching, and then wrapping those things together and developing a program of their own. And that's what they're doing. And the same thing kind of happened around awa ceremonies. There was a big sort of kerfluffle about like, well, the Hawaiian awa ceremony borrows a lot from other awa ceremonies, from even Tahitian and Tongan. And there was a lot of flack about that. And they said, well, we know we had them. We know some elements of it, but we're missing a lot because we haven't done it in a long time. So yeah, we're borrowing stuff from other people. And Herb Kane had this really good quote about it. He said, we may be experiencing the dawn of a new or simply rediscovered pan-Polynesian cultural development as a result of the increasing frequency of cultural exchanges among all Polynesians. That it's not just a matter of bringing back things from the past, but also creating new things that are at the same time, yes, it is a Hawaiian awa ceremony, but it is also increasingly a Polynesian awa ceremony, right? That what they're doing is Hawaiian navigation, but it is also oceanic navigation. The thing that's being recreated is bringing back traditions in Hawaii, but it is also explicitly and very clearly creating things that are shared. And I don't know, I think that's kind of cool. I like that. Finally, immigration. This goes on throughout the entire period. There's like John Baker, again, one of the reasons he's so interested in going to the Pacific is because his grandfather was one of the Tahitian pastors that shows up in Hawaii and settles down. And there's tons of examples of people migrating within the Pacific, finding other islands cool, and then living there and helping to reshape and constantly being factors in each other's lands through migration and movement. When Baker goes to Rarotonga, Makea Takao Ariki, the queen of Rarotonga, basically says the hills are full of half Hawaiians. There's half Hawaiians all over the place over here, to the point that Baker is able to go and see Hawaiian hula being danced by half Rarotongan and half Hawaiians living there. And it's increased even more in the present day. And we actually have, there's an entire Pacific Islander film genre emerging in Auckland because there's so many Samoans and Tongans and Cook Islanders, et cetera, there, and making awesome movies like The Legend of Barantoa. It's happening within the Pacific, this movement within the Pacific, but also out of the Pacific, where you have in Utah, for instance, more and more just a broader Pacific identity connected to being from the Pacific, in addition to a specific Tongan or Samoan identity, because they're in these sort of diasporic spaces, really starting to shape a new idea of, well, yeah, we're Samoan or we're Tongan, but we're also Pacific. And those ideas are sort of connecting back into academia, conversations within the Pacific about understanding within the Pacific this broader Pacific identity. And finally, institutions. So you end up with things like the Festival of Pacific Arts, FESPAC, University South Pacific, Pacific Islands Forum, Melanesia Leadership Spearhead Group, Polynesian Leadership Group. Problematic, like a lot of these things that I'm mentioning are problematic in one way or another, but increasingly we see institutions that are embracing these connections between different parts of the Pacific. Just like we are seeing that among the academics and the intellectuals, we're seeing this in the diaspora, and we're seeing this in the migration, we're seeing this in the cultural revival. And that kind of brings it to an end. Two things. One is that throughout this entire period, there are specific relationships and engagements with other Pacific Island peoples, with other oceanic peoples. We see those often. We see those, they are persistent. And they are a constant resource. Creating those relationships and maintaining those relationships are a resource throughout most of Pacific history. And that includes before and after contact. But the other thing that we see is, as we get more and more pressure from non-oceanic actors, from the empires, especially after 1900, oceanic peoples increasingly are developing and utilizing a collective identity, something akin to a pan-Polynesian, what starts out in some cases as pan-Polynesian, in Te Rangi Hiroa's imagining, but increasingly now as pan-oceanic identity, as essentially a way to expand those individual connections between different parts of the Pacific. And I guess I'm only 15, 20 minutes over time. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll stop the share now. Crap. Sorry, I'm not used to using two screens and I can't figure that out. There we go. Sorry, I can't hear you.
That's because I had it on mute twice, just in case I interrupted. Sorry for interrupting or like hurrying you along at the end. We have some questions. David Pursley, what are some names of the movies that you discussed at the end, and like what are their genre? Like where are they from?
It's mostly coming out of Aotearoa, but there's so Brotown, which is a cartoon. Imagine South Park, but it's all Islander kids. It is not it is high. It can be highly offensive, but it's basically an embrace of these sort of I can't remember what area of Auckland is particularly well known for being sort of pan-Polynesian communities, and they turned it into a TV show. And then the guys who did that, a lot of them are the part of the Laughing Samoans comedy troupe, like Oscar Kitely them, and they also did like Sione's Wedding and then Sione's Wedding 2, which I think were released in the US as Samoan Wedding and Samoan Wedding 2. Legend of Barantoa is another one. Oh, there's one that what's his name was involved in, Jermaine Clement, that was the Tongan ninja or something like that. But it was like, I don't know, there's a lot of good, and definitely like over the top Pacific Islander comedy is like a definite genre. And it's a lot of it is coming out of, they have a New Zealand film. They'll throw money to you if you make films in New Zealand, which is how you end up with like Taika Waititi, is because he's able to like turn out those movies, and now we have freaking Ragnarok. So, and Wellington Paranormal, which is also them. That's, yeah.
I used to screen movies for HIF, and we'd always be like trying to grab the Aotearoa movies because like we know those are going to be the good ones.
Like, they have production value.
Yeah. So this is, it's like, it felt kind of like you're writing against some received norms. Like, so my question is, and this is actually for me, because I do a lot of stuff in law, you know, in the legal definitions, Hawaiian tradition, it's just people who were here and from 1778, customs and use from 1892. And, you know, it's always tensing against the reality of a dynamic living cultural practice. So we don't get to work much with, like, you know, you're talking about historical reality of people creating things that are shared. So I guess that's where my questions is coming from. So when you're writing about shaping Oceania and marking all these interactions between different island groups, like, who are you writing against, or like who does it serve to believe that island groups are self-contained, if I understood that?
And it's okay. So a lot of it is writing against the broader regional histories of Oceania, which there aren't that many. And this is part of it, is this is kind of an overview of an effort to write a broader history of Oceania that is focused on these things. But most of those are great powers, some variation of like a great powers history, or more modern, it'll be the US and Japan, like the US and Japan duking it out over the Pacific, or now sometimes it'll be Asia versus the US. But imagining to the Pacific that it is the chessboard, and then all of these island groups, it's the interactions, and they're, from the 1960s onwards, they're more likely to talk about the interactions between islanders. So islanders are very present in those histories, but only in those islands. And then it's the connections between, and it's because they're largely the people who are writing those are writing from the perspectives of those empires. So it's against that historiographic trend to kind of focus in on, well, this is what America wanted, this is what this is what America wanted, and this is what the British wanted, and this is what the French wanted, and that's how we explain everything that happens in Pacific history. And yeah, which it benefits the empires, because it's that, I mean, that's who's writing it. But it's also in general, it's a weak historiography. There just aren't that many broad histories of the Pacific, especially over the last 20 or 30 years. There's a handful of people that were over in Atlantic history, they're now writing Pacific history, but they're not that interested in the Pacific. They're just interested in the theory. And so it doesn't, not a huge fan.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. And then, so on the other side of that, Michelle Busty Huff asked, can you expand on what might be some problems with Pan-Pacific institutions?
Oh, well, this is all about developing relationships, right? All these things are developing relationships, but often relationships are, in history, we see are about power. So we can easily see situations where these Pan-Pacific, we don't even have to imagine, where Pan-Pacific institutions can be used to essentially strengthen the hand of someone who's more powerful within the Pacific and weaken others. There was a big, with the Pacific Islands Forum, leadership of the forum is supposed to bounce between Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. Micronesia got cut out of its turn. And it went to, I can't remember, but I think it was the Cook Islands. And a bunch of the Micronesian countries split, because what they see is of these three, arguably the smallest population wise of these three major groups, and arguably the least economically powerful. And the two big ones are cut us out. And that's exactly, I mean, like they think that they're being cut out because they are being cut out. Like that's what's happening. So in these kind of situations, actually talk about this a little bit with Hawaii's in my book, Return to Kahiki, about Hawaii's relationships with other parts of the Pacific, that if the emphasis has to be put on maintaining the relationships rather than using the relationships to wield power over each other. Otherwise you just end up, like that's what happened with the Tonga, when those relationships between Fiji and Tonga was Ma'afu took advantage of those relationships to essentially seize control of half of Fiji. So there's always the possibility that these relationships turn sour if they're used for grasping power, which is just, I mean, that's human nature. So it's always something that has to be kept in mind. It's just right now, and for the last century, the bigger threat has been the outside.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we forgot to mention your book, Cambridge University Press, Return to Kahiki. Sorry, what was it called?
Return to Kahiki. I had a copy in there somewhere, but.
Well, hopefully people can check it out. And sorry, one last question. This was from Lance. He had to run. So when you said that a Tongan chief ruled Fiji, is the chief considered Tongan because his parents are Tongan, or because his native language is Tongan, or what were the criteria?
He showed up from Tonga. He was like, he was late teens, early 20s, from what I understand, the first time he went to Tonga. But when he shows up to try and like get all the Tongans together, he is coming from Tonga. His father was I want to say Tui Kanokopolu, so which would have been the sort of acknowledged sort of dominant chief politically. But George Tupou was already the most powerful military figure. So it was an understanding that George Tupou would get that title when his father died. And so Ma'afu, who's Tupou's nephew and the son of the former Tui Kanokopolu, basically isn't left with a position. So he goes to Tonga. So he's Tongan because he is from Tonga. And he understands himself as, I am a Tongan ruling in Fiji. Half of Fiji.
I'll point Lance to this part of the video when we're done. And if you have time, like, might want to check out. I might have missed some of the questions, but well, thank you so much for showing up tonight.